just the ones that I use in the office. I'm not talking about any magazines which I think bad or don't look at, because that would be negation of the point I made earlier about economy of time. I'm not particularly interested in other architects' views about architecture. This may be a shortcoming. I'm not particularly interested in looking at detailed architectural photographs or indeed plans of chosen beautiful buildings. I'd rather see a third-rate building being built than a first-rate one in the pages of magazines, and this I think will come out in the magazines I show. It's interesting that in adding up the magazines, well over 50% of the total range that I look at, I receive free. If in fact one then takes the percentage of ones that one looks at every issue and reads every issue, as opposed to ones which one gets occasionally, then the percentage that I get free rises to about 80%. And therefore it might be worth looking at the magazine that a particular institute or society or body produces, as opposed to the activities it offers. And in 2 instances, I've never been to a single meeting of the institution. I don't think I've even voted for its steering committee, and I've joined it entirely in order to receive its house journal, its magazine. We'll now go through the whole range. And the first one is building design, which I'm sure has been mentioned before. And all these first ones, and I'll mention when, in fact, one has to start paying for them, all these are free. Building design has improved immensely since Peter Murray became editor, and yet it's still a scurrilous gossip paper, and I think this is its value. I don't really think that the studied article in depth is of much value in such a magazine. I think its timing, its ability to pick the news before others have it, is its value, and indeed it's the nearest thing to an architectural design radio program, Woman's Hour, or something like that. Now, the next magazine is Industrial Equipment News, and this is one of 3 magazines which provide an answering service, which I believe Building Design does as well. But every article, every advertisement, and every product in these 3 magazines, of which Industrial Equipment News is the first one, has a number and enables you on a prepaid card to obtain more information. And this service we use very fully. When I say we, I mean myself and the office. The second one is Engineering Materials and Design, from which this cutting of the new British attempt on the land speed record car came. And the third one, which I don't have on the rack, is Mechanical Handling News. All these 3 magazines, I've had difficulty in being put on the free mailing list, because in each case they questioned whether an architect was a suitable subject to receive this magnificent free gift every month. However, one does get it, having made the point that the architect is singularly lacking in information on industrial equipment, on engineering materials, and certainly on mechanical handling. Those 3 I read and look at with delight. The next magazine, though free, is one of the ones that I mentioned that I receive as being a member of a society, and in this case it's the American Future Society, which is a rather sort of feeble organization. It does produce this magazine, which often is very feeble, but now and again picks up subjects in a anticipatory way that have been covered in other magazines, but not in quite such far-sighted nature. It's a very uneven magazine, and it's well worth looking at. The next one is the Science and Public Policy magazine of, as I am a member of the Science Policy Foundation. This, I think, is extremely good, but you do have to join the foundation. It has, again, in order to conserve one's time, to save a great deal of wasted time through reading lengthy articles, I find this magazine extremely useful in so much as it summarizes facts from all over the world in both diagrammatic and written form with a certain amount of wit and with great economy. We now move on to Offshore Engineer. This is a brand new magazine. That's the first number, and it goes free to every member of the Society of Underwater Technology, of which I am one. Being a member of the Society also enables one to get a certain range of American publications free. This is an English publication. This, combined with the one you now see with the illustrations of the NIG oil rig, is the Ocean Industry, which is a rather more thorough brother to the English magazine, probably because it's been going longer and has been produced for some years now from Houston, still the center of the oil industry. And their concern with ocean industry and offshore engineering is obvious. However, these magazines give one an indication of the scale of problems that can be solved and give one an indication in a very straightforward, internal, quiet method of how such solutions are being achieved. They're extremely well illustrated, and they introduce an element of excitement, certainly to me, and I hope to the office, purely because of the scale of the work and the speed with which it's undertaken and the degree of detail that has to be expended on such work, which one doesn't find in architecture. I wish one did, but one doesn't find that. They're also very good at explaining where things have gone wrong, and few magazines do that, and even fewer architects do it. They are very good at explaining disasters and difficulties. That is valuable to find in a magazine. It's certainly valuable, I think, to build up a file almost of possible disasters in different fields that one might encounter. The next one is the RIBA Journal. Now, I get that free through being a member of the RIBA, and it's almost the only reason that I'm a member of the RIBA, although that's slightly cheating. I'm also a member of the RIBA, not to get work, but in order to be able to work under their contract. I also use their library. However, this magazine has improved immensely since the appointment of the new editor, whose name, unfortunately, I forget. But the comment, the editorial comment and the news coverage in the RIBA Journal is very good. The dreary lectures and papers by distinguished bods that is the duty of the RIBA to put in are just as boring and irrelevant as ever. The next magazine is Underground Services, which is again a new magazine which I received free through being a member of the London Subterranean Survey Association, which deals with an aspect of planning and design, primarily underground, which most architects are not so much ignorant of, but are almost convinced that they should leave to someone else. And the Milton Keynes article is particularly interesting in so much That's a particular article I put on the rack, in so much as the whole generation, the success or otherwise of Milton Keynes, is largely based on what happens underground and whether it can happen at all. Now we're on to AD, which I have to pay for. All those other ones one gets free. AD, I think, probably has become a very enjoyable habit for me. If I had to criticize any particular issue, I could probably find a lot wrong with it. But the fact that it carries on and that it does cover a range of activity, both illustrated and written, that other magazines find either a bit fey or a bit hairy, is its strength. And long may it last. Next one. Construction news. Now, this is a beauty. I don't know how many architects see it. I hope it's in a weekly in the AA common room. Not so much the library, but, in the bar or somewhere. The range of subjects that it covers each week is wider than building design. It also, because of its name and because of its intention, tends to deal with things that aren't finished. The news tends to be in relation to obtaining contracts, in preparing equipment, material, site conditions for contracts, and in fact the difficulty or delight of achieving such contracts. It very seldom deals with the finished product, except some of the finished products that are related to site construction, such as you've just seen, the Nig Bay hostel, have great relevance to architectural problems, and yet are seen as very commonplace in that paper, and I'd recommend Construction News. New Civil Engineer is a magazine which again has improved out of all respect. In fact, it changed its name, but it is if I can read it, it is the magazine of the Institute of Civil Engineers. And that is something that should be available in the AA and indeed every school. And of course, if you're a member of the Institute, you get it free. But that is very good and extremely economic in both its prose and its illustrations. Now we get on to a magazine where I cheat, because primarily I buy this for my mother. That's Country Life. But I read it very heavily and look at it even more thoroughly. Winnie the Pooh in silver, £35, actual height 1¼ inches. I think what is good about Country Life, there's no disguising the fact that it's a sort of coffee table, middle-class magazine for the town dweller who wished he was in the country. It doesn't have the hard-edged, wet strength of a magazine like The Field, but it does have illustrations of houses and discussions of gardens and various things like that, which are from an entirely different angle. The weakest element of Country Life, in fact, is when, in fact, it asks architects to contribute and to talk about buildings. Its strength is when it does news items such as was on the screen in relation to planning aspects, where the architectural aspect and the hard planning edge is not anything like so much interest to the magazine as the agricultural or local interest view. Therefore, I think that apart from the delight of the pictures in the magazine, it's fact that it's through another pair of eyes for only 35 pence a week, I think is a great investment. And I'm delighted my mother asked me to buy it for her. New Society, I don't get every week. Now when we've got to Country Life, that's finished the ones that I get regularly. We're now getting on to ones which with the kindness, and this is what you need with magazines, is a very kind, imaginative, hard-working newsagent who will let you read the title pages and even the shorter articles without paying for the magazine, and will also order back numbers of obscure magazines that he otherwise doesn't stock. And this I have, and if anyone needs an advert, he does, and that's Hill's newsagents in Goodge Street, who are magnificent. And the New Society and New Scientist, I pick and choose. I read the contents list, and I look at the article before I buy them. As I do with New Statesman, which I, in fact, haven't put on the rack. As I say, this is an entire range of my reading, with the possible exception of odd overseas magazines, mainly fashion magazines, which I do buy now and again. The Scientific American is a lot of money, and that certainly requires a great deal of choice in the news agents before I actually buy it. But fortunately, as I say, Hills actually stock that without ordering it. Now we come on to the only foreign magazine that I've listed, and I would like just to talk about overseas magazines in general for a minute or two. I don't read any foreign language, and therefore to some extent it depends on the, I'm interested in the quality of the translation section they have in. They do vary, they vary enormously over a very short period of time, and this one, which is Techniques in Architecture, this is my favorite at the moment. One reason that it's my favorite is that it's superbly printed, that there's some very clever man or men involved, or women, in relation to the scale at which they reproduce photographs and drawings. It's also superbly indexed. There's a couple of pages on the screen. Whatever subject they're dealing with, they give a lazy man's crib list as to what the article or the building is about. And therefore you can flip through and just read these panels at the top of the magazine before you waste a lot of time going into the main article. I wish there was another foreign magazine that I could quote with the same delight at the moment, but there isn't. The last two magazines we don't have on the rack. One is Archigram, which I not only buy with delight but hoard, and the other is Private Eye. I read 3 daily newspapers and don't have a cat. I think that's it.
As part of a report on the graduate school, this morning we've got Tom Wooley and Christine Park, who've set up something called Communications Network, and they're going to explain what that is. Did you want to say something first?
All right, well, the Communications Network is basically an attempt, as part of the work of our unit, to link up the groups and activities around the country who we're involved with as part of our work, both in the graduate school and Diploma School Unit 11. Most of the work we're involved in is real live project situations, as students are actually working directly with local groups, or we're gathering information about the activities of groups in housing and community action throughout the country. And we didn't want to simply collect this information for our own use, so that it would go onto dusty shelves somewhere, but it would actually be useful to other people active in the field. So our idea was to set up a network which would provide a system for collecting the information and also making it available for other people. We've produced a leaflet which sets out the information in a very brief way, copies of which are available for anybody who wants to find out more about it. This essentially explains the nature of the communications network as being a referral agency. In other words, if people want information about what's happening in a particular field or a particular kind of housing activity, they can get in touch with us and we can give them the names of people who might be useful to them, might give them information, might help them with any queries they have about a particular subject. And also, the idea is to have a system for circulating documents which would involve people sending material to us when they produce an interesting report. And we would then list it every so often in a thing that we call a notebook. And this is a sort of 10 to 12 page document which we hope to bring out maybe 2 or 3 times a year, possibly more if it's necessary. And this lists the material and information that we've sent in, what people can contact us for, and how they can go about getting it.
Could you give us an example of, the kind of way in which somebody might use this? I mean, has anybody contacted you in the way that the network is intended to work before now?
Well, we are getting a lot of requests for help from people who are involved in activity. For instance, recently we've been contacted by people in Manchester who are trying to set up some kind of manual information book for people involved in self-help housing activity, mainly in rehabilitation areas. And as we have a group of people working on that area, we're going to get together with them and help them collect the data that they might need. On a kind of smaller level, we have great demand for some of the documents and reports that we've actually listed. But basically the idea is that say somebody is involved in a local group and they're maybe fighting a compulsory purchase order, then they could attempt to get all the very complex information on that, which may be involving a lot of work, but much more easily they could contact somebody in a nearby town who's already gone through the problem. But it's very difficult to know how to get in touch with them. They could do that through the network.
How will they find out about the network?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, there are certain ways in which we can get these leaflets out to local groups. We have a lot of contacts ourselves, and people in existing communication systems such as Community Action Magazine and so on. I mean, they will have also advertised and circulate the thing for us, but it very much depends on people building up contacts and putting us in touch with people. I mean, what we'd like to happen is that there are many people in the AA who are involved with live situations, and will probably have the similar kinds of communication problems that we've discovered, and they may also find the network useful. If they could feed stuff into us, they could give us contacts that they're working with, and we could help by listing any reports or documents that they produce.
Is it initially aimed at professionals working in this field, or is it something that somebody could go, obtain through a Citizens Advice Bureau or something like that? I mean, it's open, is that?
Perhaps you should say something about
very
that,
much.
Christine.
I mean, we very much like for it to be used in a grassroots way, for people to be able to come directly to us, and for it not to be simply something which only professionals, only people sort of writing reports and so on and so forth use. But it is a question of getting it out, getting the information that there is such a thing out in the country.
Yeah, it seems to me you've got a bit of a problem with your title because it doesn't really describe what the communication network deals with.
You mean that it's too short?
Well, it doesn't tell you what the network communicates about. There's no indication of what it's actually about.
I think that seems a valid point.
Yes, I think one of the things is the idea of the network could in fact be extended to a very broad range of area, and it doesn't. We're starting out dealing with mainly housing because that's what we're working on. But there's no reason why, in fact, it couldn't grow to cover a wider range of fields. So we've given it a fairly abstract title initially. I mean, that may be a mistake, but we assume that people will read, or at least sort of go beyond the title and read a bit more about what we're doing.
Right. In what ways could people who watch this program who are interested help you?
Well, I think
all set up and ready to go.
Well, I think they could come up to Percy Street, to the top floor, and collect these leaflets which describe it, and hand them out to people that they thought might be interested.
then what we'd like them to do is register on the network if they are involved in some kind of activity and do have information which they would like to make available to people in other areas. So say somebody gets in touch with us and asks, have you got anybody working or in touch with anybody working in a particular field, we can look through our list of contacts and put them in touch with somebody else in the AA who may be more able to help them. So we ask people to register on the network, and if they can afford it, also pay a subscription which will help to cover some of the running costs, though we still have to raise a certain amount of money to keep the thing going.
Yes, so there are two things they can do. I mean, one is they can register themselves if they feel that it would be a good thing to do, useful to them. And secondly, they can hand out these to other people who they think might be interested outside the AA. Do you think we ought to say something more specifically about paying a subscription and what it is? And
well, the idea is that people do pay for the use of the network.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be, we get a great deal of demand from people who write in and say, can you send us 2 copies of everything you have on housing? And clearly it's a very difficult way to, very difficult to deal with questions like that. And we do want to get over the idea to people that it does cost time and money to have an efficient information service. So that's why we have a subscription, and why also the documents and eventually the time that we take will be recharged to people. I mean, we're still working out the details of that.
Right. You've got this information filed under various kinds of headings. Are there some clues to people who write in, to indicate particular areas of interest, or do they just make a very general inquiry? I mean, in order to avoid them asking you for 2 copies of everything you've got on housing.
Well, they can ask for the documents which we list specifically, but we do need to find an efficient way of getting people to ask for information specifically, and in the notebook we do try to explain how we need specific requests and people to be clear about what they do want information on, so that we don't have that problem. And we will develop a library of information which will be also accessible for people to use. And we ought to mention that we do have quite a lot of literature on housing and community action in a library at the moment in Percy Street, and at certain times when we're there it is possible for people to come and look through that stuff.
Right. How long have you been doing this?
Well, since the beginning of the first term, we originally circulated the idea to a lot of people, and we got such a good response that we've now tried to set the thing up on a more formal basis. And we've also got an interest from other people who were attempting to do the same sort of thing. So it may be possible to amalgamate, for instance, people at the Polytechnic who are interested in the idea too.
I mean, it is becoming very much a going concern now, I think, after 6 months.
And are you both fairly heavily involved in it? You spend a lot of time.
Well, at the moment it has to overlap with our teaching and project activities, which is very difficult to do. And what we hope to do is to be able to afford to employ somebody on a full-time basis to deal with most of the fairly simple requests and requests for documents and contacts that come in, and then we would have a range of consultants who would be able to advise that full-time person on who would be best to deal with a particularly difficult inquiry.
Have you managed to obtain any sort of outside help on funding?
We haven't attempted to yet, but we aim to. We wanted to get it set up first, see how it was working before we did that, and that's what we're going to do next. And what we'd like to do is get it funded for a year or 2 to give it a start and to employ someone full-time. But then I think we feel that it should very much be something which is self-sufficient and does, in the end, work itself, pays for its own way.
Are there any other things that we haven't mentioned? I mean, we obviously haven't covered the whole of it. Any other vital points you'd like to get over?
Well, just to try and encourage people to come up to Percy Street and see what we're doing. I mean, we do feel a bit isolated over there in some ways. I mean, it's a very nice atmosphere over in the top floor there, so we have a lot of benefits, but there are a lot of people in the AA don't know much about what we're doing there, and we'd be glad to talk to anybody, particularly during this week when we're having review sessions of the project work which is going on, which I think people would find interesting if they want to come and take part, and it's very much related to the network idea.
The other thing is I feel perhaps it sounds a bit vague, and it isn't really at all vague, and it is a direct way of being able to contact people in the same area of interest, very simply.
Okay, so that's an open invitation to anybody interested to go across to Percy Street and find out more. Thank you both very much.
Okay, thank you.
The big story for the architectural and building press this week was the announcement of the Dobry report on development control, which was announced to the press on Monday afternoon, although the Department of the Environment had a lot of difficulty in getting it ready in time, partly because they had a strike at the printers last week, and also because George Dobry was so involved as a QC on various planning inquiries down at Canvey Island that the finished product was rather held up. Nevertheless, although the Architects Journal's press date is on a Friday, they managed to get in this week an exclusive report, an interview by Tony Aldous, the ex-architectural correspondent of the Times, which he did last week and had in the paper. The Architects Journal also has a fairly defined summary of all the various issues in the report. This was of a certain exclusivity to them, although the week before, in fact, Building Design had managed to get in a report on the front page of the of the Dobry report, which we managed to get hold of by means of what in Watergate circles is commonly known a leak. So we managed to beat the AJ on that one, although I think when they went to press they hoped they got a certain exclusive story. The AJ in their report plays it much cooler than we do. They have just a straight heading called the Dobry report, and then goes through a fairly unemotional report of exactly what is contained in Dobry's findings. Building Design, however, as usual, takes a rather different attitude to the story and headlines the story "Architects Kept Under Control," and Building Design's policy is normally to attempt to bring to light the aspects of such a report which will affect its readers, rather than giving just a straight coverage in the same way that the Architects Journal does. So the piece that we bring out is the fact that Dobry has recommended that architects shouldn't be given any more freedom in the design of buildings than they have at the moment. And I think that this tends to bring to light the difference between the Architects Journal and Building Design, in the fact that Building Design is a newspaper and aims to fill a gap in the technical press, which by producing fast news, which is easy to read and can be thrown away fairly easily afterwards. And in that way we don't attempt to compete with the Architects' Journal on technical articles and that kind of thing. The Architects' Journal attempts to compete with us on news, but doesn't often win. And I think one of the reasons for this is that building design employs professional journalists rather than architects in the main, who manage to get stories out faster, don't tend to use the obscure jargon of the profession, and aren't quite so oriented towards the incestuous London scene, which tends to alienate a lot of readers outside of London, which is perhaps shown up in readership surveys which are made, that in fact although building design's readership is lower in London than the Architects' Journal, outside in the North and Midlands it's far higher. And another advantage of having trained journalists working on the paper is that most of the news that appears in the architectural papers is concerned with technical, financial and planning matters that a trained journalist normally finds rather more easy to condense and put into readable English than perhaps some of the half architects, half journalists who write for other papers. But back to Dobry, building this week, which I've only just managed to look at because they were rather late with their production this week. It came out at lunchtime instead of first thing this morning. They lead on the story that Dobry recommends a speedier planning system to speed up all planning proposals. And they start off with a story which says that up to 2/3 of all planning applications will be dealt with in 6 weeks or less under a new simplified speeding up planning procedure if the government accepts the recommendations of the long-awaited Dobry report on development control. And that story is written by David Crawford, who's the architectural correspondent of the Sunday Telegraph. You may remember that the Architects' Journal report was written by Tony Aldis, who used to be the architectural correspondent of the Times. So lots of national papers in the architectural press this week. At the end of the building piece, the building say that at the time of going to press that the RIBA had not succeeded in making a comment on the Dobry report, and careful readers may have noted that in this week's building design we managed to cover the RIBA's comments on the report, and although we also come out on a Friday, we managed to get that out of the RIBA, although I'm not quite sure what good it did us or anybody, since the RIBA can merely say that they give a warm welcome to the many positive proposals for streamlining planning procedures, and meanwhile the RIBA will be studying the report in greater depth before issuing a comprehensive response to it, which is rather the usual bland statement that one tends to get from the RIBA on matters of this kind. Something else which is in the news, or somebody else I should say rather, is Colonel Seifert. Now he makes the news both in building design and in building. In building design this week he's mentioned in a very small item in the Scorpio gossip page. Now I wouldn't normally bring this to your attention, except that I've just had Colonel Seifert to me on the phone in what I can only describe as a spluttering rage. He had read the piece, and before I go on any further, I think perhaps I should read it to you. Scorpio writes, Scorpio hears that Richard Seifert has decided not to accept the RIBA's invitation to speak on his architecture at Portland Place in September. There has been some criticism of the RIBA's decision to ask Seifert. Nevertheless, Scorpio is sorry that architects will not now have a chance to hear the man who, in his own words, has had a greater effect on the City of London than any architect since Wren. Criticism directed in person would be more constructive than sniping from the sidelines. Now, this was a reference to the fact that the RIBA had invited Seifert to take part in their Approach to Architecture series. He was unable to attend that, but had been given another slot later on this year. Following that, there'd been a certain amount of criticism by various councillors in the RIBA and among the audience at one of the earlier Approaches to Architecture lectures held this year. And I think the Colonel thought he was going to get rather a rough reception at the RIBA, and so has decided not to take part. And he took great exception to the piece in Building Design this week, and he said that it was the most sniping piece of journalism he'd ever read in his life. Now, although it may not seem particularly serious to upset Colonel Seifert, there's one slight problem that I have to contend with, that not only is Colonel Seifert the architect to Morgan Grampian Limited, the company which owns Building Design, but he is also a close personal chairman of the chief executive. And at this moment, according to the Colonel, he's racing towards our Woolwich offices in his bright red Rolls-Royce motor car to explain his indignation to our chairman. However, I have already briefed our chairman as to the problem, and I hope that he'll be able to answer Colonel Seifert's questions. Now, building, however, tends to be rather kinder to Colonel Seifert than Building Design. Although, in fact, Building Design hadn't intended to be nasty, I think that the Colonel's paranoia got the better of him. Now, in a large 3-page interview with a very attractive photograph of the Colonel on the front, the Building magazine says that much criticism of Colonel Seifert looks unjust, for his buildings, while prolific, have a vigour and style that are clearly identifiable. They're certainly identifiable, but I'm not sure that makes criticism any the less unjust. Some of the things that the Colonel covers in his interview, I think, could do with some more study. The first thing the interviewer asks him in Building is about his comments late last year on high-rise housing. Now, it seemed to me at the time that the enormous national press coverage given to the Colonel on this occasion, when he made a statement about how terrible he thought it was that people should be living in high-rise buildings, was rather ridiculous, partly because he had himself been involved in very few high-rise buildings, and most of the reasons why he was connected with high-rise buildings was for office blocks. And also from the fact that architects had been saying for a number of years before the Colonel that high-rise building was bad, yet nevertheless the national press catch hold of him as an image of the architect and take his statements to represent a volte-face of the whole architectural profession, which just wasn't true. Nevertheless, the Colonel continues with his propoundings about high-rise buildings, and actually gives some fairly definite research that he's done on the matter, quoting various people. All very impressive. Now, in a box in the middle of the page, the Building magazine have asked him what he would do if he was made president of the RIBA. And as this is a programme about publications, I note that one of his points is that he would extinguish publications, notably the RIBA Journal, which continues to create a serious financial drain with little justification. Apart from being sad that another publication, and I shall mention some of the others that have already bitten the dust, that another publication should be killed off, I certainly don't agree with him that the RIBA has little justification, and I think that I hope that most members of the RIBA would support any movement which stopped a certainly growing opinion among RIBA councillors that the RIBA journal should be discontinued. And at the end of that piece about what he would do if he was RIBA president, in line with the Colonel's attitude that in fact it is wrong for architects to criticise other architects, he believes that it's terribly unprofessional to do so. He mentions a little story which I think is worth relating again. He says that he thinks the RIBA should reverse its present defensive attitude. A past president, he writes, once related how the then Prime Minister, Ted Heath, asked him why British architects put up such bad buildings. Instead of saying, absolute nonsense, we have the finest architects in the world, he just paused and let Ted Heath get away with it. What could I say, he said later. I think this sort of thing is very bad, says the Colonel. Now, whether the Colonel is really sincere in thinking that we have the finest architects in the world, I think perhaps is not is something that Mr. Dobry in his report doesn't really agree with, because one of the reasons why he decided to retain planning controls on architecture was that he felt that the examples which we've been shown over the last 20 years are so dismal that he felt that architects really needed to be kept under greater check. And I think most probably the Colonel is one of those that he was pointing to at the time. Next, to cartoons. Now, the only surviving cartoon in the architectural press at the moment is the marvellous Hellman in the AJ. Building Design did have a cartoon up until Christmas, but it's now been discontinued. Hellman, if we can get this one on the camera, gives a rather nice little story which goes through the various other professions, and I'll just read out some of the captions where he says that the Royal Town Planning Institute is going great guns at the moment as a result of the energy/economic crisis. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is thriving as never before. The Institute of Heating and Ventilation Engineers has been given a new lease of life since the energy crisis, but then ends with a picture of an architect wandering off into the distance saying, funny, I've forgotten, what was I going to say next? Well, can't have been important, looks like rain again, wonder what's on telly tonight, shouldn't hang around if I were you. Which is a fairly good note on which to move to a survey in the Architects Journal on architects' workload, which everyone thought was producing enormous great redundancies within the architectural profession, but figures coming out now seem as though, at least at the moment, the situation isn't too bad. In last week's Building Design, we had a story which was a very easy one to get hold of, but nobody had actually thought of doing it before, and that was ringing up the Department of Employment and finding out how many architects were on the dole. And we discovered that the number of trained architects on the dole was actually 318, which was rather higher than last year when they had 97 architects on the dole, which is in fact a 66% rise, which looks fairly bad in percentage terms, but 318 people out of work out of 20,000 isn't really too bad, especially when you compare it to the building workers who are out of work, who are getting near something like 200,000. But one interesting thing which did come out of the story, and that was that there were 149 planners registered as unemployed last month, whereas last year there were 118, which isn't really very much of a rise. And in fact, as far as planners go, there should have been a drop, because in fact they're in greater demand now than they even were then, which seems that most probably there are a lot of planners on the dole who aren't technically on the dole, but who are actually working for community groups and that sort of thing. So in fact I think the figures that one gets from the Department of Employment should be taken with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, the next week, that's this week, the Architects Journal has come out with some figures which it has obtained by ringing up regional chairmen of the RIBA, who were asked last month by Fred Pooley, president of the RIBA, to find out what sort of redundancies there were among their members. And really the main point of the AJ story is that there's no crisis among the employment of architects. And it all looks fairly impressive, but then just at the right time, Building Design has managed to come up with its own little survey, which we did among firms of architects, which comes up with basically the similar conclusions, although over a wider sphere, and splitting the sort of workload that there is about at the moment into the regions, which shows that London's doing pretty badly, Scotland's doing very well, and come this summer students are going to be doing terribly badly. That in fact it'll be very difficult for students to get any work at all, or to get work during years out and that sort of thing this summer. So if you want to get a job, I should go to Tehran or somewhere like that. And it was quite interesting that one woman I spoke to when we were doing this survey gave a very tragic story about, because of her decreasing workload and the fact that they'd just before Christmas lost a £1 million job, which formed 75% of their work. Her partner had left her in a panic. All the technicians had left. She got one secretary, and if she was left £75,000 tomorrow, she'd give up architecture and do something useful instead. Now, there was one omission among most of the architectural papers, which was only covered, in fact, by Building Design and the construction paper, Construction News, which I have here. And that was the fire that occurred in the World Trade Center last week. Now, the fire has certain connections with the Towering Inferno, the film which is shown in London at the moment, and I was surprised that it didn't actually get greater coverage, although certainly getting news from New York, the English papers in fact covered it very lightly. Getting information from New York was very difficult, partly because Monday was a public holiday there, and also because telephone calls kept on misrouting, and while ringing one of our correspondents in New York, I was misrouted to Australia and woke some poor lady up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So the problem's actually getting information out of there, perhaps illustrated from some slight differences in the Building Design story and the Construction News story, where Construction News say that fire damage was confined to the 11th floor, although water spread down through 2 floors and smoke found its way up to the 16th to sort of other areas. Building Design's information shows that fire spread through telephone cable shafts and took hold on another 6 floors and caused a certain amount of damage. But those are some of the problems of actually getting facts from people like fire brigade chiefs and things like that, which are accurate at the sort of speed one has to on a weekly paper. Now, buildings this week covered in the papers. There's nothing really very exciting. None of the buildings are really, I don't think, worth giving very much more of a mention. The Architects Journal, their sort of little picture page at the front, covers the new Carlton House Terrace development designed by Howard Lobb and Partners. It's a very smart, expensive building, and I really only mention this because this was very tightly embargoed by the Langs, who in fact were dealing with most of the press inquiries on this, for Wednesday, which is a very unsuitable day for building design to have something embargoed to, because it means that the Architects' Journal comes out with it first. We much prefer things to be embargoed on a Friday, so that the Architects' Journal doesn't get it till a Wednesday. Nevertheless, this being so, we realised that the Carlton House terrace development was about to be completed, and went down there last month and took our own photographs. However, in the middle of the photographing, the public relations man from Langs, whose offices unfortunately were just over the road, came over and started threatening us with all sorts of terrible things, like we were doing naughty things under the Official Secrets Act because the building was owned by Crown Properties. I can't really see what that's got to do with it, but that's what he said, and how he'd wouldn't send us any more information if we published anything before his rather artificial embargo date. However, we did publish it and didn't hear any more, and they did send us all the information, but it meant that we managed to get the building covered at least about a month before the Architects' Journal did. And I think at this point it's quite worth mentioning this whole sort of embargo situation in papers, where everybody likes to get the news first, and everybody likes to have buildings published in their own paper before it's published anywhere else. And the normal practice is that the Architectural Review or the Architectural Press will sign up architects when they know they're about to complete a building and say, let's have all the information first. If you give it to anybody else, we won't publish it at all. Now, the thing is that everybody likes the idea of having their buildings published in the Architectural Review, which is obvious enough because it's nice, pretty pictures, they're expensive photographers and jolly good reproduction. So that means that other papers, to some extent building, and certainly to a great extent building design, because of course we just publish on ordinary old sort of newspaper, which is a little bit, doesn't really flatter buildings quite as much as architects would like. We have to find alternative ways around this sort of cabal of restrictions. And so I won't tell you all the ways round it that we find, because that might give the AJ some ideas. But nevertheless, we do tend, in many cases, to get coverage of buildings sometime before the Architects' Journal manage it. Much, I may say, to the exasperation of some of the architects who have signed all these little contracts with the architectural press, and get terribly worried that their buildings aren't going to be published after all if we've published it first. On to the next one. And that, I now want to talk about building in slightly more general terms. That's building the magazine, which actually it's getting much better. I used to find it an incredibly boring paper to read, and it was always impossible to find out where anything was. And it's getting much easier now, I must say, to find things in it. It's got a new editor, a chap called Neil Murphy, who's a very nice chap, and he's brightened the whole thing up quite a lot. And I'm not quite sure whether, in fact, it's easier to find things in the paper because it's got that many fewer ads, a sort of sickness that all papers are suffering from at the moment, or whether, in fact, the graphics are getting very much better. Nevertheless, in brightening up the paper, they've pinched a few ideas from building design, which I suppose is only natural. And this week they have this thing called View From, which is rather similar in many respects to Building Design's Platform series, which we run every week. And they've got Dick Gardner in this View From series, who has just been appointed head of a new unit on continuing education in the construction industry at York University. Before that, he was Director of Education at the RIBA. And in his article, and I quote this because I'm sure it's of relevance to people at the AA, he says, "Hardly anywhere can one find a school that is able to define its objectives and its course in clear, simple terms." And that, I think, brings me fairly well up